This is Anders Behring Breivik standing inside an Oslo courtroom as judges prepare to deliver Norway's harshest civilian sentence. When addressed by the court, he tells the judges that he does not recognize their authority and refuses to accept the legitimacy of the proceedings. He acknowledges carrying out the attacks, but insists they were justified and makes clear that he does not regret his actions. Breivik carried out Norway's worst act of violence since the Second World War on July 22, 2011. That afternoon, he parked a plain van outside the government headquarters in Oslo. The vehicle contained a large explosive device prepared during months of planning. At 3:25 in the afternoon, the bomb detonated near the Prime Minister's office, destroying parts of the executive district. 8 people were murdered and 209 were injured as emergency responders rushed into streets filled with debris, smoke, and wounded civilians. While police concentrated on the explosion, Breivik left the city and drove toward the island of Utøya, located about 45 minutes from Oslo. The island was hosting a summer camp organized by the Workers' Youth League. Wearing a police uniform and carrying false identification, he presented himself as an officer sent to brief camp organizers on security measures following the bombing. A ferry transported him to the island, where participants believed he had come to help ensure their safety. After arriving, Breivik gathered camp staff and began shooting before moving across the island. Many campers initially followed his instructions because of the uniform he wore. As the situation became clear, participants ran into wooded areas, hid inside buildings, or attempted to escape by swimming across the water. Emergency calls flooded police dispatch centers, but most units were still responding to the Oslo bombing. The attack continued for more than an hour, leaving 69 people dead and 32 injured, including many teenagers attending the camp. Shortly before police arrived, Breivik contacted emergency services and indicated that he intended to surrender. Despite this, the shooting continued until tactical officers reached the island and arrested him. He surrendered without resistance. Rescue teams transported survivors and victims by boat back to the mainland while families across Norway waited for confirmation about those missing. In total, 77 people died during the attacks in Oslo and Utøya. During interrogation, Breivik admitted responsibility and explained that the attacks were meant to promote a manifesto he had distributed earlier that day outlining his ideology. Prosecutors charged him with terrorism and mass murder intended to create widespread fear and destabilize society. Psychiatric experts evaluated him before trial, producing conflicting conclusions, but a second assessment determined that he understood his actions and could be held criminally responsible. The trial began on April 16, 2012, in Oslo District Court. Prosecutors presented detailed evidence of the planning, the bombing, and the shooting on Utøya. Survivors described their experiences while the court read the names and details of victims aloud, a process that lasted nearly an hour. Throughout proceedings, Breivik told the court he accepted responsibility for the acts but refused to admit criminal guilt and maintained that his actions were politically motivated. On August 24, 2012, the court found Breivik guilty of terrorism, mass murder, and causing a fatal explosion. He received 21 years of preventive detention, the maximum civilian sentence in Norway, with a minimum non-parole period of 10 years and the possibility of extensions if authorities determine he remains a danger to society. After sentencing, he repeated that he did not accept the authority of the court and confirmed he would not appeal, ending the trial with a reaction defined by refusal and lack of regret rather than remorse. Number 2, Darrell Edward Brooks, Jr. Darrell Edward Brooks turned his own trial into a confrontation with the court from the beginning. During proceedings, He repeatedly interrupted the judge, argued over basic courtroom procedure, and openly challenged the authority of the court. When asked routine questions about jury instructions, he responded with hostility, telling the judge he had already heard her and accusing the court of disrespecting him throughout the entire process. Deputies frequently stood ready as the judge warned him about decorum, but Brooks continued speaking over her, setting the tone for a trial defined as much by his behavior as by the crimes themselves. On November 21, 2021, the city of Waukesha, Wisconsin held its annual Christmas parade, an event returning after cancellation the previous year. More than 60 parade entries moved through downtown streets under the theme Comfort and Joy. At approximately 4:39 in the afternoon, Brooks drove a red sport utility vehicle past barricades and directly into parade participants. Witness recordings showed the vehicle entering at speed while spectators initially believed it was part of the procession. Within seconds, people began running as the vehicle struck individuals along the route. Police officers shouted commands and struck the hood attempting to stop him, and an officer later fired a weapon in an attempt to disable the vehicle. Investigators stated the driver moved in a zigzag pattern to hit as many people as possible. By the end of the attack, 6 victims were deceased, ranging in age from 8 to 81, and more than 60 people, including many children, were injured. After leaving the parade route, Brooks abandoned the immediate area. Roughly 30 minutes later, he approached a nearby residence claiming he was homeless and needed help calling transportation. The homeowner allowed him inside briefly, unaware of the ongoing emergency. Police tracking the damaged vehicle quickly located him and ordered him to raise his hands. He surrendered without resistance and was arrested. During interrogation, Brooks denied owning or driving a vehicle and claimed he had been dropped off after an argument. Detectives confronted him with surveillance footage, witness identification, and confirmation that the vehicle belonged to his mother and that he possessed the keys. Investigators repeatedly asked about intent or motive, but Brooks refused to provide an explanation despite hours of questioning. Prosecutors later presented Brooks's long criminal history to establish pattern and credibility issues. Court records showed his first felony charge in 1999 while still in high school, resulting in jail time and probation. In 2007, he pleaded guilty in Nevada after impregnating a young individual and served a prison sentence before being released in 2008. Additional criminal cases followed in Wisconsin and Nevada, including outstanding warrants and lifetime registration requirements. In 2020, he faced charges after allegedly firing a weapon during a dispute involving family members. Months before the parade attack, he was arrested in Georgia following a domestic violence incident where witnesses reported he assaulted his partner and displayed a firearm. Just weeks before the parade, he was accused of striking the same partner and running her over with a vehicle, then posted bail 2 days before the attack. Prosecutors emphasized these events to argue escalation and disregard for legal consequences. Brooks chose to represent himself at trial, a decision that shaped nearly every hearing. He raised arguments connected to sovereign citizen ideology, claimed the court lacked jurisdiction, and refused to acknowledge his own legal name, arguing documents written in capital letters did not represent him. Judge Jennifer Doro repeatedly ruled those arguments invalid and instructed him to follow courtroom procedure. Brooks responded with interruptions, prolonged arguments, and confrontational exchanges. At one point, he placed boxes in front of himself to block the judge's view, forcing deputies to remove them. Each removal triggered further complaints from Brooks, who accused the court of unfair treatment and insisted questions directed at him were never answered. The prosecution also introduced details from his past convictions during testimony. When a prior offense involving a young individual was mentioned in court, Brooks reacted immediately, arguing loudly that the record was inaccurate and attempting to dispute facts already established by conviction. Even during recesses, he continued arguing, attempting to correct the record and accusing prosecutors of misrepresentation. The judge repeatedly called breaks to restore order. Because of ongoing disruptions, Brooks was removed from the courtroom multiple times and placed in a separate room where proceedings continued by video link. Eventually, due to continued misconduct, the judge ruled he forfeited the right to call additional witnesses, including his own mother. During the closing stages, Brooks attempted to argue jury nullification despite direct warnings that such arguments were not permitted. The judge dismissed the jury to warn him again, explaining legal limits on closing arguments. Brooks insisted he should be allowed to tell the jury what he called the truth. When proceedings resumed, he immediately raised the prohibited argument again, prompting objections and instructions for jurors to disregard his statement. After deliberating for 3 hours and 15 minutes, the jury returned guilty verdicts on 76 charges, including intentional homicide and reckless endangerment. On November 16, 2022, sentencing took place after victims described lasting physical and emotional harm caused by the attack. The judge stated that Brooks had caused widespread trauma and concluded the community could only be protected if he remained imprisoned permanently. He received 6 consecutive life sentences without parole, 1 for each victim, along with additional sentences totaling more than 760 years connected to injured victims and related charges. Throughout sentencing, Brooks offered no acceptance of responsibility. When the sentence was finalized, the courtroom audience reacted audibly, marking the end of proceedings that had been defined by confrontation, repeated disruption, and a refusal by the defendant to recognize the authority judging him. Number 3, Maxim Gelman. This is Maxim Gelman, the man New York tabloids nicknamed Mad Max, sitting in a Brooklyn courtroom while a judge prepares to lock him away for 200 years. Even at sentencing, onlookers described him as unruly, laughing, yelling, and acting like the victims' families were part of a show, not people grieving. Prosecutors framed it as a spree of pure chaos across New York City, carried out with a knife, stolen cars, and threats, ending only when he was finally pinned down and arrested on a subway train. It started in Sheepshead Bay, Brooklyn, just after 5 o'clock in the morning on February 11, 2011. Gelman stormed into his mother's home demanding his passport because he claimed federal agents were after him and he planned to flee to the Dominican Republic. His mother believed he was drunk, and the argument escalated until his stepfather, Alexander Kuznetsov, came into the kitchen swearing at him in Russian. Gelman grabbed a knife and attacked. When the knife broke, he kept going with a carving fork. Investigators later said Kuznetsov was stabbed 55 times. Gelman did not hurt his mother physically, but he took Kuznetsov's gray Lexus and sped off, hitting a crossing guard and breaking her leg while he fled. After that first murder, Gelman later claimed he knew he would be caught, so he decided he would take down people he called rats who had wronged him. His next stop was the home of Anna Bulchenko, the mother of a female acquaintance, Yelena Bulchenko. Gelman arrived around 10:30 in the morning, entered, and murdered Anna. He then left and waited for hours because Yelena was not home. When Yelena returned later and found her mother deceased, she called emergency services. Gelman came back again around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, spotted her outside on the phone, and approached with the knife hidden along his jacket sleeve. Yelena ran, but he caught her and stabbed her 11 times, murdering her before driving away again in the stolen Lexus. The violence kept moving, and it kept changing shape, stabbing, then stealing cars, then using those cars as weapons. After ramming into another car, Gelman was confronted by the driver, Arthur DeCrescento. Gelman stabbed him 3 times, then took the vehicle. Not long after, he hit Stephen Tannenbaum, a 62-year-old pedestrian who later died from those injuries. By this point, Gelman had left multiple scenes behind him. A stepfather murdered at home. A mother and daughter murdered in one day. A driver stabbed during a carjacking. A pedestrian struck and fatally injured, and a city-wide manhunt expanding by the hour. In the early hours of February 12th, Gelman abandoned DeCrescento's car just before 1 o'clock in the morning. He hailed a livery cab, then stabbed the driver, Fitz Fullerton. He approached another vehicle with a couple inside and attacked the driver, Sheldon Pottinger, stabbing him multiple times in the hand before stealing that car too. By morning, the spree pushed onto the subway system. Just after 8 o'clock, Gelman boarded a northbound 3 train at 34th Street Penn Station. Passengers recognized him from news coverage and alerted authorities. Gelman moved toward the conductor's area, demanding to be let in while claiming he was police. When the door did not open, he turned on Joseph Lozito, stabbing him in the head and face. Lozito fought back, wrestled him down, and Gelman was arrested once he was pinned on the ground. When the case reached court, the charges reflected the full spread of the spree: multiple counts of first-degree murder, attempted murder, assault, carjacking, and a hit-and-run that turned fatal. His public defender appeared with him at arraignment in a Brooklyn courtroom on February 13, 2011. Reports said that even while being led from the precinct to the courthouse, Gelman showed no remorse and claimed he had been set up. The defense leaned on the idea that something was wrong with him mentally, arguing there was something going on upstairs that prevented him from controlling himself. Prosecutors, meanwhile, laid out the timeline like a chain with no missing links: the passport argument, the stepfather's murder, the murders at the Bolchenko home, the carjackings and stabbings, the pedestrian struck, the cab driver stabbed, the subway stabbing, and the capture. Gelman eventually pleaded guilty to all charges on November 30, 2011, which moved the case straight toward sentencing. On January 18, 2012, he stood in New York Supreme Court in Kings County as Justice Vincent Del Giudice delivered the final punishment. Gelman's courtroom behavior became part of the story, and reports described him as unruly, laughing or yelling at the judge and at the families and friends of the people he had murdered. The judge called him a violent sociopath and sentenced him to 200 years in prison. It was the legal system's blunt answer to a 28-hour spree that left 4 people dead and 5 others wounded, all driven by one man who kept moving until he ran out of places to run. Number 4. Navide Afzal Haq. This is Naveed Afzal Haq in a Seattle courtroom, finding out that the death penalty is off the table, but life without parole is not. He does not act grateful or relieved. Instead, prosecutors point to his own words and choices to show the court he knew exactly what he was doing and that he meant it. On July 28, 2006, shortly before 4 in the afternoon, Haq arrived at the Jewish Federation of Greater Seattle building in Seattle, Washington, carrying 2 semi-automatic handguns, a knife, and extra ammunition. Investigators later explained that he had legally purchased the weapons the previous day after completing the waiting period. He forced entry into the building by threatening a young girl connected to an employee and making her help him gain access through security. Once inside, he moved through the offices and began shooting employees. Workers attempted to hide or contact emergency services, but several were struck by gunfire. Pamela Wachter, a longtime staff member and community volunteer, was fatally wounded while attempting to escape. Other victims survived serious injuries, including one employee who was pregnant at the time. During the attack, Hack called emergency dispatch while holding a hostage at gunpoint. He explained that he carried out the shooting to draw attention to political grievances connected to conflict in the Middle East and United States foreign policy. Investigators later used this call to demonstrate that he was communicating clearly, responding to questions, and describing his motives in a structured way while the crime was still unfolding. When police sirens approached, Hack exited the building and surrendered with his hands raised. Officers entered and secured the scene, confirming one fatality and multiple wounded victims. The legal process began the next day. At his initial court appearance, Hack attempted to avoid attending the hearing and asked that cameras be excluded, but the judge denied both requests and set bail at $50 million. Prosecutors charged him with aggravated murder, multiple counts of attempted murder, kidnapping, burglary, and malicious harassment classified as a hate crime. At the time, aggravated murder carried only two possible outcomes under Washington law: either life imprisonment or execution. Prosecutors later decided not to pursue the death penalty after reviewing extensive records showing a history of mental health treatment, which legally counted as a mitigating factor. Hack's defense centered on mental illness, arguing that he could not fully understand or control his actions during the shooting. Early in the proceedings, he attempted to plead guilty to all charges, but the judge refused to accept the plea until competency evaluations were completed. He later changed his position and entered a not guilty plea, while his attorney stated that Hack understood the charges and could assist in his defense. The first trial in 2008 ended in a mistrial when jurors could not reach unanimous decisions on most counts. That outcome forced prosecutors to prepare a second trial, this time strengthening their argument that the attack was planned and intentional rather than uncontrolled behavior. During the retrial in 2009, prosecutors introduced recorded jail phone conversations between Hack and his mother. In those conversations, he described carrying out the shooting intentionally and expressed pride in what he had done. The prosecution used these recordings to argue that Hack was aware of his actions and their consequences. They also presented evidence showing preparation before the attack, including acquiring weapons and testing them beforehand. The defense again argued mental illness, but prosecutors emphasized his organized behavior, his explanations during the emergency call, and his own admissions afterward as proof of deliberate decision-making. On December 15, 2009, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all counts, including aggravated first-degree murder. At sentencing, the judge imposed life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, along with an additional 120 years. Hack showed little visible reaction as the sentence was announced. Survivors and families in the courtroom reacted emotionally, some expressing relief that the case had finally ended after years of legal proceedings. The court made clear that the punishment reflected both the loss of life and the lasting harm suffered by the victims, concluding that Hack had acted knowingly and that the sentence ensured he would remain imprisoned for the rest of his life. Number 5. Dylan Storm Roof. This is Dylan Storm Roof sitting in a federal courtroom after prosecutors tied him to one of the most devastating hate crimes in modern American history. When the case reached sentencing, he did not show remorse. He tells the court he felt he had to do it and says he still feels the same way. Even when families spoke about what they lost, he did not shift. His posture stays fixed on justification, not regret, and the court treats that as part of the danger he represents. On February 28, 2015, mall security at Columbiana Center in Columbia called police after Roof, dressed in all black, asked employees unsettling questions. Officers questioned him, searched him with consent, and found strips of buprenorphine and naloxone on him without a valid prescription. He was arrested for misdemeanor illegal substance possession and banned from the mall for a year. On March 13, 2015, he was investigated again for loitering in a parked car near a park in downtown Columbia. A search found an AR-15 forearm grip and 6 unloaded magazines capable of holding 40 rounds each. He told police he wanted to buy an AR-15 but did not have enough money. He was not charged because possessing the forearm grip was not illegal. On April 26, 2015, he was arrested again for trespassing on the mall grounds in violation of the ban, and the ban was extended for 3 more years. Those encounters become part of the larger timeline prosecutors later point to as early markers of his drift toward violence. On June 17, 2015, Roof walked into Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in downtown Charleston, South Carolina during a Bible study. The church was not just a place of worship. It was a historic landmark and a symbol of black life in the state, tied to civil rights history and long community organizing. Roof sat through the study like any other attendee. He listened, stayed through the full session, and waited until the group began closing prayers. Then he pulled a handgun and opened fire inside the church. The victims were mostly trapped in a room where there was no time to react. 9 people were murdered and a 10th person was injured. Among the deceased was Clementa C. Pinckney, the senior pastor and a state senator. The attack unfolded as the people in the room were praying, which made the scene feel even more personal to the community watching it unfold afterward. In the immediate aftermath, emergency calls came in describing multiple people shot inside the church and pleading for help. By the time law enforcement arrived, Roof had already left the area. A manhunt began quickly and ended the next morning. On June 18, 2015, Roof was located and arrested in Shelby, North Carolina. Investigators questioned him after his capture and he admitted carrying out the shooting. He explained that he chose the church because he expected black people would be gathered there. He also said he carried out the shooting to ignite a race war. When asked directly about his ideology, he identifies himself as a white supremacist. He describes the murders as intentional, not accidental, and that admission becomes one of the most damaging pieces of the case because it aligns with what investigators later uncover about his planning. After the shooting, law enforcement discovered a website titled The Last Rhodesian connected to Roof. Officials confirmed it was his. The site contained photos of him posing with symbols of white supremacy and neo-Nazism, and it included a manifesto where he laid out his views toward black people and other groups. Investigators treated that material as a window into motive and premeditation because it showed he had been building an ideological explanation for violence long before the church shooting. The evidence also included reports that about a week before the attack, 2 friends tried to hide his gun after he said he was going to murder people, but the gun was returned to him. When Roof entered the court system, prosecutors brought the case on both federal and state tracks. Federally, he faced 33 charges including hate crime counts tied to the targeting of a black congregation during worship. In court proceedings, survivors and relatives of the deceased spoke about the victims and the impact of their loss. Some family members also spoke in a way that shocked the public, offering forgiveness and urging him to repent. Roof does not respond with regret. He continues to present the act as something he believed he had to do, and he does not give the families what they asked for, which was any sign of repentance or acceptance of wrongdoing. On December 15, 2016, Roof was convicted in federal court on all 33 federal charges. On January 11, 2017, he was sentenced to death for those federal convictions. The state case moved in parallel but ended with a different kind of permanent lock. On April 10, 2017, Roof pleaded guilty in South Carolina State Court to the murder charges and received 9 consecutive life sentences without parole. The result was 2 layers of punishment for one act: a federal death sentence and state life sentences designed to ensure he would never walk free, even if anything changed on one side of the case. Number 6. Brenton Harrison Tarrant. In the case of Brenton Harrison Tarrant, the declared white supremacist who did not move or shed a tear as he stared ahead in a Christchurch courtroom, the silence was part of the shock. He faced 51 counts of murder and 40 counts of attempted murder, plus a charge of engaging in a terrorist act. While victims and survivors packed the courthouse and the country listened, he kept his expression flat, offered no apology, and declined to address the court during sentencing, leaving families to speak into a void. On March 15, 2019, Tarrant began a Facebook live stream, filming himself as he drove toward the first target. Behind that camera was months of online radicalization and a worldview built around the so-called Great Replacement theory, the belief that minorities are conspiring to eliminate the white race. He admired earlier mass attackers and framed his own plan as the next step. At about 1:40 in the afternoon during Friday prayer, he entered the Al-Nur Mosque in Riccarton. Men, women, and children were inside, gathered for worship, and he opened fire. The live stream captured the attack as it unfolded, turning a place of prayer into a murder ground in real time. He came prepared to keep shooting without stopping. He had multiple firearms, extra ammunition, and magazines loaded and ready, and he had stored additional weapons and supplies in his vehicle. He repeatedly paused the attack to return to the car, swap weapons, reload, and walk back inside. Survivors described people pleading to be spared and people being shot where they fell. He did not limit his violence to the interior of the mosque. He fired at anyone he could see, inside and outside. And the terror spilled across the surrounding area as people tried to flee. When he believed there was no one left to murder at Al-Nur, he returned to his vehicle and drove to the Linwood Islamic Center, arriving minutes later while more worshippers were inside. He opened fire again and murdered additional victims there. By the time he left the second location, 51 people would be dead and dozens more wounded, with many injuries caused by gunfire. He then drove toward a third target, but by then police had caught up with him. Roughly 30 minutes after the first shooting began, officers rammed his car off the road, dragged him out in the middle of the street, and arrested him, ending the rampage before he reached another place of worship. The country reacted with unified condemnation. Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern addressed the nation that evening, describing the violence as a terrorist attack and rejecting both the attacker and the ideology behind him. International leaders pledged support as New Zealand mourned. Even Tarrant's family members spoke publicly in disbelief, saying they were overwhelmed by the reality that someone in their family could commit such an act. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered to support victims' families as they prepared to face him, turning the steps of the court into a public stand against what he had tried to represent. Inside court, victim impact statements cut through the courtroom with raw anger and grief. Dozens of people spoke directly toward the man who had targeted them during prayer, calling him a coward and describing him as pathetic. One family member's statement became widely remembered for its force, describing him as trash to society and saying he deserved to be buried in a landfill. Another begged the judge to impose the harshest punishment available, urging a sentence that would ensure he would never again breathe free air. The message from the public gallery was consistent. The pain was permanent, and the only acceptable outcome was a sentence that locked him away forever. When the judge delivered sentencing remarks, the court focused on how he murdered. The judge said Tarrant shot people in the back, ignored the wounded begging to live, and violated places of worship where people came together for peace and fellowship. Then came a legal decision New Zealand had never made before. On each of the 51 murder charges, the judge imposed life imprisonment and ordered that the sentences be served without parole. On the 40 attempted murder charges, the judge imposed prison terms to run alongside the life sentence. And on the Terrorist Act charge, the judge imposed life imprisonment as well. It was the first time New Zealand had ever sentenced someone to life without the possibility of parole, and it was chosen because the court concluded that no minimum period could meet the need to hold him fully accountable. The reaction in the courtroom belonged to everyone except him. Families and survivors were relieved because the sentence removed any future path back into society. People watching noted that he tried to look unbothered, as if the punishment meant nothing, but the decision was final regardless of his face. The sentencing also helped trigger lasting changes beyond the courtroom. New Zealand moved to ban the types of semi-automatic weapons used in the attack, a direct policy response tied to the scale of what he carried out. Tarrant left the court as he entered it, without tears, without visible regret, and without a word to soften what he had done, while the country closed the legal door behind him for good. Number 7. Jeremy Joseph Christian. In the case of Jeremy Joseph Christian, the criminal who screamed at his victim on the stand, the courtroom became another stage for the same hatred he brought onto public transit. Prosecutors charged him with 2 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder in Portland, Oregon, after a train confrontation turned into a fast, brutal attack. Even before the trial ended, Christian made it clear he was not there to show remorse. He was there to perform, threaten, and push his ideology in front of a judge, a jury, and the people he hurt. Before the fatal stabbings, Christian was already known for far-right activism and public rants centered on white supremacy and free speech. He regularly appeared at rallies, calling himself a revolutionary and using extremist language about who belonged in the country. That politics did not stay on sidewalks and microphones. It followed him onto buses and trains, where he drank, harassed minorities, and threatened violence toward people he targeted at random. The day before the fatal attack, Christian focused his aggression on a passenger named Demetria Hester. When Hester demanded that he stop harassing a bus driver, Christian turned on her, followed her as they exited, and the argument escalated. He threw a bottle and struck Hester in the face, leaving her with a black eye and swelling. Hester pepper sprayed him and he ran. But that incident became part of the criminal case, tied to intimidation and assault charges that showed the jury his violence was not a one-moment explosion. It was already building. On May 26, 2017, Christian boarded a Max Light Rail train and started yelling racist and anti-Muslim slurs at 2 teenagers, one a 17-year-old Muslim Somali girl wearing a hijab, and the other her 16-year-old black friend. Witnesses said he told them to go back to Saudi Arabia, said they should murder themselves, and made anti-Muslim statements while ranting about his First Amendment rights. The 2 girls moved toward the back of the train to get away. As the train remained crowded, 3 men stepped in to block Christian and de-escalate. Taliesin Mirdine, Namkai Meke, Micah David Cole Fletcher, and Ricky John Best. The confrontation lasted seconds. Christian threatened that if he was touched again he would murder, and when the pushing continued he pulled a folding knife and attacked. Police said the stabbings took less than 12 seconds as he slashed and stabbed Best, Namkai, Meche, and Fletcher, cutting Fletcher in the neck. Christian fled at the next stop into the nearby neighborhood, but passengers called emergency services and followed from a distance. Medics could not revive Best and he died at the scene. Namkai Meche died later at a hospital, and Fletcher survived with serious wounds. Christian was arrested minutes later, just blocks away, as officers closed in with multiple units. Court filings described him throwing the knife during arrest, and recordings captured him boasting afterward that he had stabbed people in the neck and could die in prison happy. The investigation linked the train violence to the earlier bottle attack, creating a single narrative for prosecutors, escalating hatred, threats, and then lethal force. The case was widely condemned in Portland as an example of hate speech turning into violence in a public space with no warning. From his first court appearances, Christian acted like the courtroom was another rally. He shouted slogans about free speech, yelled threats, and when prosecutors treated the train attack as terrorism tied to hate, he argued he saw it as patriotism. During trial in early 2020, prosecutors built the case around surveillance footage, cell phone video, witness testimony, and Fletcher's account as the surviving victim. The jury found Christian guilty on all counts, and on June 24, 2020, the judge sentenced him to 2 life terms without parole, plus an additional 51.5 years for related charges, and Christian was removed from the courtroom during sentencing after another furious outburst directed at a surviving victim. In June 2024, the Oregon Court of Appeals affirmed his convictions in full. Number 8. Peyton Gendron. This is Peyton Gendron at the Erie County Courtroom in Buffalo, New York, as the judge prepares to deliver a sentence that will decide the rest of his life. When addressed during sentencing, he admits he carried out the shooting and acknowledges that he targeted people because they were black. He tells the court he acted out of hate shaped by what he consumed online and says he regrets the decisions that led to the attack. Even as families describe the lives taken from them, the focus of the courtroom remains on the scale of violence he planned and executed, and whether any words spoken afterward could carry weight against what had already happened. On May 14, 2022, Gendron drove more than 200 miles from his hometown of Conklin, New York, to the Tops Friendly Market supermarket on Jefferson Avenue in Buffalo's East Side, a neighborhood he deliberately selected because of its large black population. Wearing body armor, a military-style helmet, and carrying a Bushmaster XM-15-style rifle modified to accept high-capacity magazines, he began live-streaming through Twitch as he approached the store. Moments later, he opened fire in the parking lot, murdered 3 people before entering the building. Inside, he continued shooting shoppers and employees, moving through aisles while people ran, hid, or searched for exits. 10 people were murdered and 3 others were injured during the attack. All of the victims who died were African Americans. Customers and workers attempted to survive by barricading doors and hiding in storage areas and coolers. Emergency calls reported multiple victims and gunfire echoing through the store. Former Buffalo Police Lieutenant Aaron Salter Jr., working as a security guard, confronted the shooter and fired his weapon in an attempt to stop him. Because Gendron wore body armor, the shot did not stop him and he returned fire, murdering Salter. Investigators later determined that about 60 rounds were fired during the attack. Witnesses described confusion and fear as responders rushed toward the building while victims were still being evacuated. Police arrived within minutes and confronted Gendron near the front entrance. Officers observed him raise the weapon toward his own neck before speaking to him and convincing him to drop it. He removed parts of his tactical gear and surrendered without resistance. The live stream was shut down quickly, but recordings had already circulated online, showing portions of the attack to viewers worldwide. Authorities immediately classified the shooting as an act of domestic terrorism and a racially motivated hate crime. Investigators later uncovered extensive preparation behind the attack. Gendron had visited Buffalo earlier to study the location and created drawings of the supermarket layout. 2 days before the shooting, he posted a 180-page manifesto online describing extremist beliefs and outlining his intention to carry out violence inspired by previous mass attackers he had researched online. Prosecutors stated that during the 3-hour drive to Buffalo he had repeated opportunities to turn back but continued with the goal of murdering as many black people as possible. The rifle used in the attack contained slurs and references to earlier attackers, reinforcing evidence of ideological motivation and planning. Gendron was charged with multiple counts including first-degree murder, hate crimes, and domestic terrorism motivated by hate. He later pleaded guilty to all state charges. During sentencing, victims' families addressed him directly, describing the loss of parents, grandparents, and community members whose absence permanently changed their lives. At one point, a grieving relative rushed toward him before deputies intervened, underscoring the emotional intensity inside the courtroom as survivors confronted the person responsible. On February 15, 2023, the judge sentenced Gendron to 11 life sentences without the possibility of parole, along with additional years in prison. The court concluded that the attack was deliberate, racially motivated, and designed to spread fear beyond the immediate victims. As the sentence was finalized, the courtroom reaction reflected the weight of permanence. The teenager who live-streamed violence now faced a lifetime behind prison walls, a legal outcome meant to ensure he would never again walk freely after an attack that left a community permanently marked by loss. Number 9. Michael David Dunn. This is Michael David Dunn standing in a Jacksonville courtroom as the judge prepares to announce his final sentence. Even after conviction, Dunn maintains that he acted in self-defense and continues to insist he believed his life was in danger that night. He does not accept that his actions were unjustified, telling the court through his testimony that he was reacting to what he believed was a deadly threat. As the sentence approaches, the courtroom centers on his refusal to see the shooting as wrongdoing, while the victim's family waits for legal closure. On November 23, 2012, 17-year-old Jordan Davis spent the day with friends visiting shopping malls before stopping at a Gate Petroleum gas station in Jacksonville, Florida. The driver left their red Dodge Durango running while entering the store, leaving Davis and 2 friends inside listening to music. Dunn and his fiancée, traveling for a wedding, parked beside them. Dunn became irritated by the loud bass coming from the teenager's vehicle and asked that the music be turned down. The volume briefly lowered, but an argument followed when Davis told his friends to turn it back up, turning a young individual's disagreement into a confrontation. Dunn later stated that Davis threatened him and that he believed a weapon was being pointed in his direction. According to evidence presented in court, Dunn retrieved a handgun from his glove compartment and fired multiple shots into the SUV. Jordan Davis was struck several times as the teenagers attempted to drive away. Dunn stepped out of his vehicle and continued firing as the SUV reversed across the parking lot. The teenagers escaped the immediate scene, but Davis collapsed from his injuries and died shortly afterward. Instead of calling emergency services, Dunn and his fiancée returned to their hotel room. They ordered food and remained there while police responded to the shooting scene. The following morning, news reports confirmed that a teenager had died. Dunn drove back to his home nearly 2 hours away, where he was later arrested after investigators traced his license plate through witness information. During interrogation, Dunn repeated that he feared for his life and claimed he believed one of the teenagers had a gun. Investigators searched the vehicle and surrounding area but found no weapons, a detail prosecutors later emphasized repeatedly during trial. The court proceedings focused heavily on Dunn's self-defense claim. His fiancée testified that he never mentioned seeing a weapon that night, contradicting his later statements. Prosecutors argued that Dunn escalated the situation by using deadly force after a verbal dispute and continued firing even as the teenagers attempted to flee. The first trial resulted in convictions for attempted murder but ended in a mistrial on the murder charge, leading to a second trial where jurors reviewed forensic evidence, witness testimony, and Dunn's own recorded statements describing his fear and justification. On October 1, 2014, the jury found Dunn guilty of first-degree murder for the death of Jordan Davis, along with additional convictions tied to the surviving teenagers. During sentencing, the judge stated that Dunn's decision turned a simple disagreement into irreversible loss and required permanent removal from society. He received life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, plus 90 years in prison. Dunn's reaction remained consistent with his earlier testimony, maintaining that he had acted to defend himself, closing a case defined by confrontation, denial, and a sentence that ensured he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. Number 10. Ahmad Alissa. This is Ahmad Alissa sitting inside a Boulder, Colorado courtroom as the judge prepares to deliver a sentence after a jury finds him guilty on every count tied to one of the deadliest mass shootings in the state's history. Throughout the proceedings, Alissa shows little visible reaction as the verdicts are read. Prosecutors describe the attack as deliberate and calculated, while the court focuses on the scale of loss left behind. When sentencing begins, the outcome is no longer about whether he committed the crime, but how the law will respond to 10 lives taken inside a neighborhood supermarket. On March 22, 2021, Alissa entered the King Soopers supermarket in South Boulder, armed with a Ruger AR-556 style pistol and additional ammunition. Shortly after arriving, he opened fire outside the store, shooting victims in the parking lot before moving inside. Emergency calls flooded dispatch lines as witnesses reported an active shooter. A nearby live stream captured the chaos as people ran for safety and injured victims lay on the ground. Inside the store, shoppers and employees attempted to escape through exits while others hid in offices, storage rooms, and closets as gunfire echoed through the building. Police began receiving reports of shots fired at approximately 2:30 in the afternoon. Officers rushed toward the scene while customers fled through side exits. Witnesses later described groups of strangers guiding each other toward safety, hands placed on shoulders as they ran without knowing where the shooter was located. Boulder police officer Eric Talley was among the first responders to arrive. He entered the store to confront the gunman and was fatally shot. As officers surrounded the building, specialized units evacuated survivors section by section while the shooter continued moving inside. After an extended police response, Alissa was located within the store. He surrendered to officers while injured from gunfire sustained during the confrontation. 10 people were confirmed dead, including Officer Talley, and shoppers ranging from young employees to elderly customers completing routine errands. Investigators later determined that Alissa had purchased the weapon used in the attack only days earlier and had been planning the assault for months. Prosecutors argued that he entered the supermarket intending to murder as many people as possible, transforming an ordinary afternoon into a mass casualty scene. During trial, the defense argued that Alissa suffered from severe mental illness and could not distinguish right from wrong at the time of the shooting. Prosecutors rejected that claim, presenting evidence of preparation and deliberate action. jurors heard testimony from survivors, investigators, and families whose lives had been permanently altered. After deliberating for several hours, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all 55 charges, including 10 counts of first-degree murder. Throughout the proceedings, Alyssa remained largely expressionless, speaking quietly with his attorneys but showing no dramatic response as the verdict confirmed permanent imprisonment. At sentencing, family members and survivors addressed the court, describing lasting trauma, lost futures, and the absence left by loved ones who never returned home that day. The judge imposed 10 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, one for each victim, along with additional prison terms totaling more than 1,334 years. As the sentence was announced, Alyssa showed little outward reaction. The court concluded that the punishment reflected intentional violence carried out against innocent people, ensuring he would spend the remainder of his life in prison, closing a case defined by mass loss and a sentence measured not in years but in lifetimes. Number 11. Dzhokhar Tsarnaev. This is Dzhokhar Tsarnaev inside a federal courtroom as jurors prepare to decide whether he will spend the rest of his life imprisoned or be executed for the Boston Marathon bombing. Throughout the proceedings, he shows little visible emotion, while prosecutors outline the scale of destruction caused by the attack. As sentencing approaches, the focus shifts to accountability, motive, and the calculated decisions that followed the bombing. His reaction becomes part of the final stage of the case as the court weighs punishment for an act defined as terrorism against civilians. On April 15, 2013, Tsarnaev and his older brother Tamerlan carried backpacks containing homemade pressure cooker bombs toward the finish line of the 117th Boston Marathon in Massachusetts. Thousands of spectators lined the streets as runners completed the race. The first bomb detonated near the finish line, sending smoke, debris, and injured victims across the crowded area. While people were still trying to understand the first explosion, Tsarnaev placed his backpack nearby and walked away. 12 seconds later, the second bomb exploded, murdering 3 people and injuring hundreds more. Emergency responders rushed toward victims suffering catastrophic injuries as chaos spread across the scene. After the explosions, Tsarnaev moved away with the crowd and left the area. Surveillance footage later showed him entering a convenience store shortly after the attack, appearing calm while purchasing items before leaving. Investigators spent days reviewing footage before releasing images of the 2 suspects on April 18th. That same night, the brothers approached Massachusetts Institute of Technology police officer Sean Collier and shot him inside his patrol vehicle in an attempt to steal his firearm. They then carjacked a sport utility vehicle and forced the owner to drive with them until he escaped at a gas station and contacted emergency services. Police tracked the stolen vehicle, leading to a confrontation in Watertown, Massachusetts. Officers exchanged gunfire with the brothers while explosive devices were thrown toward responding units. During the encounter, Tamerlan Tsarnaev was shot multiple times while officers attempted to restrain him. Dzhokhar Tsarnaev entered the vehicle and drove through the scene while officers were still engaged, striking and dragging his brother before fleeing. Tamerlan later died from his injuries. Authorities launched a massive manhunt involving thousands of officers while residents were ordered to remain indoors as neighborhoods were searched house by house. Later that evening, a homeowner noticed blood inside a covered boat parked in his yard and called police. Thermal imaging confirmed movement inside the vessel. Officers surrounded the area, and after hours of negotiation and tactical positioning, Tsarnaev emerged injured and surrendered. During interrogation, he acknowledged participating in the bombing and explained that the attack was motivated by extremist beliefs and retaliation connected to international conflicts. Investigators recovered a handwritten message inside the boat claiming responsibility for the bombing and describing the victims as casualties of war. Prosecutors charged him with 30 federal counts, including use of a weapon of mass destruction resulting in death. The trial began on January 5, 2015, lasting more than 4 months. Prosecutors presented surveillance footage, forensic analysis, and testimony from survivors and investigators. The defense argued that Tsarnaev acted under the influence of his older brother but did not dispute his involvement. On April 8, 2015, the jury found him guilty on all 30 counts. During sentencing hearings, victims and families described permanent injuries, lost relatives, and lasting trauma caused by the bombing. Tsarnaev, who had remained mostly silent during trial, later addressed the court and acknowledged responsibility while expressing regret for the harm caused. On May 15, 2015, the jury sentenced Tsarnaev to death by lethal injection on multiple capital counts. The court determined that the attack deliberately targeted civilians at a public event and created widespread fear across the country. His reaction marked the closing moment of a case defined by coordinated violence, a nationwide manhunt, and months of courtroom testimony. Following sentencing, he was transferred to federal death row, where he remains imprisoned as the legal outcome of one of the most significant terrorism cases in modern American history. Number 12. Ethan Crumbley. In the case of Ethan Crumbley, the teenager responsible for one of the most shocking school shootings in Michigan history, he stands inside an Oakland County courtroom as the judge prepares to decide whether he will ever live outside prison walls again. By the time sentencing begins, he has already admitted responsibility for the attack. Facing families whose children never returned home, he tells the court that his actions were the result of choices he made and acknowledges that those decisions brought everyone into that courtroom. The proceedings focus not only on what he did, but on the level of planning revealed long before the shooting began. On November 30, 2021, 15-year-old Ethan Crumbley entered Oxford High School in Detroit, Michigan, carrying a semi-automatic handgun that belonged to his father. After going into a school restroom, he armed himself and began moving through the hallways as students changed classes. Witnesses later described confusion turning into panic as gunfire echoed through crowded corridors. He fired repeatedly at students and staff while moving methodically through the building. Emergency calls flooded dispatch within minutes as teachers attempted to secure classrooms and students ran for exits while first responders rushed toward a scene still considered unsecured. 4 students were murdered during the attack. Tate Meyer, Madison Baldwin, and Hannah Street Juliana died at the scene, while Justin Schilling later died from injuries sustained during the shooting. Survivors described fleeing through hallways and hiding wherever they could as officers arrived and evacuated the school. Crumbley was arrested shortly afterward without prolonged resistance. When his parents arrived at the police station, investigators observed that his concerns centered on personal matters rather than the victims, leaving officers and family members confronted with what appeared to be emotional detachment immediately following the violence. As investigators examined his digital history and personal writings, prosecutors uncovered extensive preparation. Journals and text messages outlined detailed plans for the attack, including lists of equipment and descriptions of intended targets. Entries revealed fantasies about carrying out a large-scale school shooting and causing suffering not only to victims but also to their families. Evidence also showed earlier plans involving violence against another individual that were never carried out. Internet searches conducted before the attack included questions about prison sentences and life imprisonment for juveniles in Michigan, suggesting awareness of potential consequences before the shooting occurred. During trial proceedings, prosecutors presented the writings, recordings, and planning materials to demonstrate intent and premeditation. School officials testified about the chaos inside the building and efforts made to save injured students. Mental health testimony described episodes of psychological distress, while classmates spoke about bullying and isolation observed before the attack. Crumbly initially entered a plea connected to insanity claims but later admitted guilt to all charges, formally acknowledging that his actions caused the deaths of 4 students. The case shifted from determining responsibility to deciding punishment. At sentencing, families described the lasting impact of the attack, explaining how ordinary school routines ended in permanent loss. Statements emphasized that the victims would never reach adulthood while the defendant would continue living. The court reviewed the extent of planning, the deliberate movement through hallways, and evidence showing he selected targets while continuing to fire multiple rounds. The judge concluded that the attack reflected intentional decisions carried out despite opportunities to stop, emphasizing that the violence was executed step by step rather than impulsively. The court ultimately sentenced Ethan Crumbly to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, along with additional years attached to related convictions. The case extended beyond the shooter himself, when his parents, James and Jennifer Crumbly, were later charged and convicted of involuntary manslaughter for failing to secure the firearm and ignoring warning signs leading up to the attack. Their convictions marked the first time parents in the United States were held criminally responsible for a mass school shooting committed by their child. The sentencing closed proceedings with the court determining that the level of planning, execution, and loss required permanent imprisonment, ensuring that the teenager who once wrote about wanting notoriety would spend the rest of his life confined by the consequences of those decisions. Number 13. Anjem Choudhury. In the case of Anjem Choudhury, the extremist preacher who spent decades promoting radical ideology across Britain, he stands inside a London courtroom as judges prepare to decide how long he will remain behind bars for directing a terrorist organization. By the time sentencing arrives, prosecutors describe him not as a man who carried out attacks himself, but as someone who influenced and guided others toward violence. When confronted with the charges, he denies directing any group, insisting he only spoke about personal beliefs and experiences. The court instead examines years of speeches, lectures, and organizational leadership that investigators say helped sustain extremist networks operating in the United Kingdom and beyond. For more than 20 years, Choudhury delivered public talks, private meetings, and online lectures promoting Islamist extremism. He co-founded the organization Al-Muhajirun in the 1990s alongside Omar Bakri Mohammed. The group openly rejected Western democracy, supported the implementation of strict religious law in Britain, and organized demonstrations designed to attract media attention and recruit followers. Authorities later concluded that individuals connected to the organization were linked to a significant percentage of terrorism cases investigated in Britain before 2015, and that the network inspired numerous foreign fighters to travel overseas for violent causes. After Al-Muhajirun was banned by the British government, Choudhury continued operating through successor groups created under different names, including Al-Ghuraba, Islam for UK, and Sharia for UK. Investigators argued these organizations functioned as continuations of the same network designed to avoid legal restrictions. Through speeches and online platforms, he praised extremist figures, defended violent attacks, and encouraged supporters to adopt radical ideology. Authorities later connected members and followers of his movement to multiple acts of violence, including attacks in London and abroad, strengthening the prosecution's argument that his role extended beyond speech into organized direction. In 2014, Chowdhury pledged allegiance to the Islamic State after the group declared a caliphate in Iraq and Syria. Prosecutors later presented evidence showing he communicated support through private messages, online lectures, and international contacts tied to the organization. Undercover investigators and intelligence agencies monitored his activity, gathering recordings of lectures in which he addressed supporters connected to banned extremist groups. Law enforcement agencies from the United Kingdom, the United States, and Canada coordinated evidence showing he continued promoting and directing extremist activity despite previous legal restrictions placed on him after earlier convictions. Counterterrorism officers eventually moved in to arrest him at his East London residence. During questioning, Chowdhury denied belonging to or directing any terrorist organization, claiming his speeches were personal opinions rather than operational leadership. Prosecutors countered with digital evidence, witness testimony, and recordings demonstrating structured communication with followers and coordinated messaging aligned with banned groups. The trial focused heavily on whether his actions crossed from ideological expression into active direction and encouragement of terrorism. In 2016, he had already been convicted for encouraging support for the Islamic State and served a prison sentence. After his release, authorities alleged he resumed extremist activity online once restrictions expired. The later investigation revealed continued involvement with al-Muhajirun networks operating internationally. Prosecutors argued that his influence persisted through encrypted communications and organized lectures that reinforced extremist recruitment and loyalty structures. The court concluded that his leadership role remained active rather than symbolic. In 2024, Anjem Chowdhury was convicted of directing a terrorist organization, encouraging membership, and supporting extremist activity. He received a life sentence with a minimum term of 28 years, meaning he will be in his 80s before becoming eligible for parole. The ruling marked one of the most significant counterterrorism convictions in modern British legal history, with judges determining that years of ideological leadership and organizational direction played a measurable role in sustaining extremist networks. Number 14. Martez Terrell Abram. In the case of Martez Terrell Abram, the Walmart employee who returned to his workplace armed with a firearm after being suspended, the courtroom focus turned to how he reacted when forced to confront video evidence of his own actions. During trial proceedings, he sat through testimony describing the attack step by step, and when shown surveillance footage, he acknowledged that he was the person firing the weapon. As prosecutors replayed the moments leading to the deaths of his co-workers, Abram broke down repeatedly but still had to answer direct questions, confirming what the court could clearly see. In July 2019, Abram was suspended from his job at a Walmart store in South Haven, Mississippi, after allegedly threatening another employee with a knife during a workplace dispute. According to testimony, the suspension deeply affected him, and investigators later argued that resentment built in the days that followed. A few days later, the 39-year-old returned to the store early in the morning carrying a firearm and a backpack that also contained gasoline. Prosecutors stated that he arrived before many employees expected danger, entering a familiar workplace where co-workers were beginning their shifts. Once inside the parking area, Abram confronted store manager Anthony Brown and shot him. Evidence presented in court showed that Brown died at the scene. Abram then moved into the building, where employees and customers began running as gunshots echoed through the store. Witnesses described confusion and panic as people attempted to escape through exits, while others hid behind shelves and counters. Inside the store, Abram located another manager, Brandon Gales, and shot him as well, causing fatal injuries. Investigators testified that the movement through the store showed deliberate targeting rather than random firing. Police officers responding to emergency calls arrived quickly and encountered Abram leaving the building. An exchange of gunfire followed, during which Abram was injured. One responding officer was also wounded during the confrontation. Officers took him into custody and transported him to a hospital, where he later appeared in court proceedings from a hospital bed while recovering from his injuries. The prosecution argued that the timeline, preparation, and movement through the store demonstrated planning carried out over several days following his suspension. During trial, prosecutors and defense attorneys disagreed sharply over intent. The prosecution presented surveillance footage, witness testimony, and timelines showing Abram arriving early and immediately confronting specific victims. The defense argued that emotional distress connected to his employment situation influenced his actions and challenged claims of long-term planning. An eyewitness described seeing one victim lying on the ground moments after being shot, while a responding officer testified about hearing gunfire immediately after exiting his patrol vehicle and feeling the impact of a bullet during the exchange. A critical moment came when Abram took the stand and was required to watch surveillance recordings of the attack. Under questioning, he confirmed that he was the individual shown firing at the victims. Prosecutors paused the footage multiple times, asking him to identify each action. Abram admitted to shooting both victims and acknowledged firing additional shots. The jury later deliberated for approximately 50 minutes before returning guilty verdicts on capital murder and attempted murder charges. During sentencing, family members of the victims addressed Abram directly, speaking about loss and forgiveness while asking the court to impose the strongest penalty available. The judge ultimately sentenced him to death for the murders and imposed an additional life sentence related to the injured officer. The ruling concluded a case centered not only on the violence inside the store but also on Abram's courtroom reaction, as he was forced to confront recorded proof of actions he could no longer deny, ending proceedings. Number 15. Ahmad Khan Rahimi. In the case of Ahmad Khan Rahimi, the man responsible for a series of coordinated bombings across New York and New Jersey, the courtroom centered on how he faced judgment after attacks that turned ordinary city streets into scenes of sudden explosions. During proceedings, Rahimi appeared before the court from a hospital bed after being captured in a violent confrontation with police. Prosecutors described him as someone who carried out calculated acts intended to spread fear across crowded public spaces, while the court examined how close the attacks came to causing mass casualties. On September 17, 2016, the first explosion occurred in Seaside Park, New Jersey, where a pipe bomb detonated inside a trash can near the route of a United States Armed Forces charity event. A scheduling delay meant participants had not yet gathered, preventing injuries. Investigators later discovered additional explosive devices nearby that failed to detonate. Authorities quickly realized the incident was not isolated when, later that night, a pressure cooker bomb exploded in the Chelsea neighborhood of Manhattan, New York City, sending metal fragments and ball bearings through a crowded street and injuring 31 people. Emergency responders rushed to the area as chaos spread through surrounding blocks. Although none of the injuries were fatal, the explosion caused widespread panic and forced the evacuation of nearby buildings. Police searching the area discovered more unexploded devices placed throughout the neighborhood. Bomb squads safely removed the remaining explosives, preventing further detonations. Surveillance footage later showed Rahimi moving through city streets carrying bags believed to contain the bombs, while additional video captured him purchasing materials used to construct explosive devices at stores in New Jersey. Following the attacks, Rahimi disappeared, triggering a large-scale manhunt across the tri-state area. Law enforcement agencies released his identity and warned the public as officers searched neighborhoods connected to him. 2 days later, police located Rahimi sleeping outside a bar in Linden, New Jersey. When officers approached to question him, he suddenly pulled a firearm and opened fire. A chase and shootout followed, during which several officers pursued him while exchanging gunfire. Rahimi was shot multiple times and seriously wounded before being taken into custody alive. Investigators later recovered evidence linking him directly to the bombings, including fingerprints and DNA found on explosive devices, as well as surveillance recordings documenting his movements. Prosecutors told the court that Rahimi had left his home carrying multiple bombs with the intention of placing them in populated locations to cause maximum harm. A notebook recovered by authorities contained writings interpreted as a declaration of responsibility and references to extremist ideology that investigators said motivated the attacks. Rahimi was charged with several federal offenses, including use of a weapon of mass destruction, bombing a public place, destruction of property using explosives, and using a destructive device during a violent crime. Appearing in court through video connection while hospitalized, he entered a plea of not guilty. During trial, jurors reviewed surveillance footage, forensic evidence, and testimony outlining how each device had been constructed and planted. After a 2-week trial and deliberations that lasted into a second day, the jury found him guilty on all counts. At sentencing, the court concluded that Rahimi's actions were deliberate attempts to terrorize civilians and that only permanent imprisonment could protect the public. He received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. The case closed with recognition that although the explosions injured dozens, the failure of several devices to detonate prevented far greater loss of life, leaving Rahimi to spend the remainder of his life imprisoned for attacks that shook one of the world's busiest cities. Number 16, Fraser Glenn Cross. In the case of Fraser Glenn Cross, the former white supremacist leader who carried out shootings at Jewish locations in Kansas, the courtroom focused heavily on his reaction after conviction. During hearings, Cross spoke openly, interrupted proceedings, and defended his actions as justified rather than criminal. Even as the court moved toward sentencing, he showed no acceptance of wrongdoing and continued arguing that his actions were motivated by ideology, not guilt. On April 13, 2014, Cross drove to the Jewish Community Center in Overland Park, Kansas. In the parking lot, he opened fire and fatally shot 69-year-old William Corporone and his 14-year-old grandson Reet Underwood. Witnesses reported sudden gunfire as families arrived for afternoon activities. After leaving the scene, Cross traveled a short distance to the Village Shalom Retirement Center, where he shot and murdered 53-year-old Terry Lamano outside the facility. Police responded quickly and located him nearby, taking him into custody without further violence. Body camera footage captured officers arresting Cross shortly after the attacks. Investigators stated that he appeared calm and even requested alcohol following the shootings, behavior prosecutors later used to argue lack of remorse. Authorities determined that the attacks were racially motivated and connected to Cross's long history of extremist beliefs and leadership roles within white supremacist organizations, including earlier involvement with Ku Klux Klan, affiliated groups, and the White Patriot Party. Cross dismissed his defense attorneys and chose to represent himself during trial, turning proceedings into repeated confrontations with the judge. He interrupted hearings, challenged courtroom authority, and delivered long ideological statements unrelated to legal arguments. Prosecutors presented prior interviews and public statements showing years of anti-Semitic rhetoric to establish motive and intent. During questioning, Cross admitted that he targeted locations he believed were connected to Jewish communities and acknowledged that he wanted his actions remembered publicly. Evidence showed that although Cross believed his victims were Jewish, all 3 individuals murdered were Christians. Despite this, prosecutors argued that the intent behind the attacks remained clear because the locations were deliberately selected based on religious identity. Throughout testimony, Cross continued defending his actions as patriotic rather than criminal, and stated that he felt liberated after committing the shootings, statements that reinforced the prosecution's argument that he posed an ongoing danger. As trial tensions increased, Cross repeatedly clashed with the judge over evidence rulings and courtroom procedure. He challenged the jury directly during closing stages, warning them against delivering a guilty verdict. After approximately 2 hours of deliberation, jurors returned unanimous guilty findings on capital murder and related charges. The verdict concluded a trial marked by disruption, ideological speeches, and refusal by the defendant to acknowledge responsibility. At sentencing, the court imposed the death penalty by lethal injection under Kansas law. The judge ruled that the racially motivated murders and lack of remorse justified the harshest punishment available. Cross was transferred to death row, where he remained imprisoned until his death in 2021 at the age of 80, ending a case defined by extremist violence and a courtroom reaction centered on defiance rather than regret. Number 17. Corey Ali Muhammad. In the case of Corey Ali Muhammad, the gunman who claimed violence was justified by divine purpose, the courtroom was forced to confront a defendant who openly admitted his intent without hesitation. When prosecutors asked whether he meant to murder his victims, Muhammad answered plainly, showing no effort to deny responsibility. His own words became some of the strongest evidence presented against him. On April 13, 2017, in Fresno, California, Muhammad fatally shot Motel 6 security guard Carl Williams after an argument about motel policy. Surveillance footage showed Muhammad walking away before suddenly turning back and firing multiple shots at close range, murdering the unarmed guard. Investigators later said Muhammad believed the incident would lead to a life sentence, and instead of surrendering, he decided to escalate the violence. 5 days later, after learning police had identified him as a suspect, Muhammad began a shooting spree in downtown Fresno. Armed with a revolver, he walked through city streets firing 17 rounds in roughly 90 seconds. He first approached a utility truck and shot passenger Zachary Randalls, who later died from his injuries. Muhammad then moved through nearby blocks, shooting at pedestrians and deliberately selecting victims based on race. Mark Gassett was shot and murdered outside a charitable organization, and David Jackson was chased into a parking lot where Muhammad fired multiple rounds, murdering him. Several others narrowly escaped after he chose not to shoot individuals he believed were not white. Police responded within minutes and arrested Muhammad after a brief pursuit. During questioning, he openly admitted targeting white men, telling investigators he wanted to murder as many as possible and describing the attacks as retaliation for historical injustices. Authorities classified the shootings as a hate crime rather than terrorism, noting that Muhammad acted alone and was not affiliated with any organized extremist group. At trial, Muhammad testified in detail about the murders. When asked why he fired again at a victim already lying on the ground, he answered that his intention was to ensure death. Prosecutors presented social media posts showing prior expressions of racial hatred and anti-government beliefs. reinforcing claims that the attacks were planned acts of targeted violence. Throughout proceedings, Mohammed frequently interrupted court sessions with political statements and demands for reparations. When victims' families addressed the court, Mohammed temporarily left the courtroom, refusing to hear their statements. Relatives described the lasting trauma left behind, including children struggling to cope with the loss of parents. Upon returning, Mohammed resumed shouting slogans, prompting repeated warnings from the judge and eventual removal from the courtroom due to continued disruptions. The jury ultimately found Mohammed guilty on all counts, including multiple murders and attempted murders tied to the shooting spree. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 206 years to life. Despite the verdict, Mohammed continued speaking loudly as he was escorted away, leaving behind a case defined by deliberate violence, explicit motive, and a defendant who never attempted to conceal what he had done. Number 18, Ali Mohammed Brown. This is Ali Mohammed Brown standing inside a New Jersey courtroom as a judge prepares to lock him away for life. Even after admitting he pulled the trigger on a teenager at a traffic light, Brown frames the violence as part of who he became. He apologizes to the family, then follows it with a cold declaration that he does not regret what he did, treating a young man's final moments like a statement instead of a tragedy. On the night of June 25, 2014, 19-year-old college student Brendan Tevlin was driving home in West Orange, New Jersey, when he stopped at an intersection. 3 men approached his vehicle on foot. One of them spoke briefly with Tevlin through the passenger side, close enough for Tevlin to register what was happening, and then the ambush turned into an execution. From the passenger side of the vehicle, shots were fired into the car 10 times. Tevlin was hit repeatedly and died at the scene, trapped inside the driver's seat while the intersection became a crime scene. Investigators arrested 33-year-old Ali Mohammed Brown. Brown later confessed to being the shooter. As detectives dug deeper, they tied him to a broader pattern of violence, including the murders of 2 men in Seattle, Washington, who were shot at close range in what authorities described as execution-style attacks. Prosecutors said Brown's statements showed a motive rooted in jihadist beliefs and a mission of vengeance against the United States for what he believed the government had done in Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan. Brown told investigators that Tevlin's murder was not random, but part of an overarching plan to murder Americans, and that the men murdered in Washington were connected to the same plan. Brown ultimately pleaded guilty to multiple charges, including first-degree terrorism, a conviction described as the first of its kind in New Jersey state history. In court, the sentencing judge described the case in stark terms, calling it one of the most heinous and horrific matters he had ever presided over. When it was Brown's turn to speak, he apologized to Tevlin's parents and loved ones, but then undercut it by saying he appreciated what he did, that he did not regret anything, and that the violence made him who he was. Before imposing the sentence, Judge Ronald D. Wigler addressed Brown directly, describing his behavior as callous, ruthless, and barbaric, and said he would spend the rest of his life behind bars with no chance of parole. Brown was sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, sealing the outcome in a case where murder occurs in seconds, and the defendant's reaction in court was defined not by remorse, but by justification. Number 19. James Egan Holmes. This is James Egan Holmes standing inside a Colorado courtroom as the judge prepares to deliver one of the longest prison sentences in American history. When sentencing arrives, he does not address the families or attempt to explain the devastation left behind. His reaction remains distant and detached. the same controlled stillness investigators observed from the moment he was arrested behind the theater minutes after the shooting ended. On July 20, 2012, Holmes carried out a planned attack at the Century 16 Theater in Aurora, Colorado during a midnight screening of The Dark Knight Rises. He entered like any other moviegoer and sat among the sold-out crowd. Shortly after the film began, he exited through an emergency door, retrieved weapons and protective gear from his car, and returned wearing a gas mask and tactical equipment. He released smoke canisters into the auditorium, filling the theater with confusion and panic, then opened fire into the audience. Emergency calls captured gunfire echoing through the building while people tried to escape through dark aisles and blocked exits. Responding officers arrived within minutes but struggled to enter because of heavy smoke and uncertainty about possible chemical threats. Inside, they discovered a mass casualty scene with victims spread across the theater floor. Patrol cars became emergency transport vehicles as officers rushed the wounded to hospitals before ambulances could arrive. 12 people were murdered and 70 others were injured. Holmes was arrested behind the theater without resistance, standing near his vehicle surrounded by firearms and ammunition. During arrest, he calmly informed officers that his apartment had been rigged with explosives, forcing authorities to evacuate an entire residential building while bomb squads dismantled complex traps. Investigators later established that the attack had been carefully prepared. Holmes legally purchased multiple weapons, thousands of rounds of ammunition, and tactical gear in the months leading up to the shooting. Prosecutors showed that he selected the theater because its layout allowed maximum casualties and slower police response. Evidence presented at trial demonstrated deliberate planning, including writings that described violent thoughts and preparation steps. Holmes later claimed the shooting was meant to increase his sense of self-worth and relieve depression, explanations the prosecution used to reinforce that the attack was intentional and calculated. During early court appearances, Holmes appeared expressionless and disengaged, fueling discussion about his mental condition. He pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, leading to extensive psychiatric evaluations. Experts testified that although he suffered from mental illness, he understood his actions and their consequences. After a lengthy trial, the jury found him guilty of 24 counts of first-degree murder and 140 counts of attempted murder, along with explosives-related charges. When sentencing began, survivors and families described the permanent damage left behind, while Holmes declined to speak. The jury could not unanimously agree on the death penalty, which resulted in life imprisonment instead. The judge stated clearly that Holmes would never return to free society and sentenced him to 12 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus 3,318 additional years in prison. In the end, Holmes remained silent as the sentence was read. The court treated his lack of visible emotion as consistent with the calculated nature of the attack. He will spend the rest of his life behind bars serving 12 life sentences along with 3,318 years, a punishment designed to ensure he never walks free again. Number 20. Shamsiddin Faridouni, Saida Krami Racha Balizoda, Dalerjon Mirzoyev, and Mohammad Sobir Faizov. This group of men was standing inside a Moscow courtroom after carrying out one of the deadliest terrorist attacks in modern Russian history. When they are brought before the judge, the courtroom immediately focuses on their condition rather than their words. One man appears with a heavily bandaged head and a visibly damaged ear. Another is wheeled into court wearing a hospital gown, barely able to remain conscious. Cameras capture bruises across their faces as terrorism charges are read. And the silence inside the courtroom reflects the scale of what prosecutors say they carried out. On March 22, 2024, the four men entered Crocus City Hall in Krasnogorsk, Moscow Oblast, shortly before a concert was scheduled to begin. The venue held thousands of civilians waiting for a live performance. According to investigators, the attackers arrived armed with automatic rifles, knives, and incendiary devices. They moved through the entrance hall and immediately opened fire on unarmed civilians. Witness footage later shown in court displayed people running in panic while gunfire echoed through corridors and the main auditorium. Prosecutors explained that the attackers deliberately targeted crowded areas to maximize casualties. They fired repeatedly into groups of concert-goers trapped between entrances and seating areas. Some victims believed the noise was part of the performance until people began collapsing. After shooting dozens of people, the attackers poured flammable liquid and ignited fires inside the building. Smoke quickly filled escape routes, forcing survivors out of hiding and into open spaces where gunfire continued. Emergency testimony presented to the court stated that many victims died from smoke inhalation after becoming trapped behind locked exits while flames spread across the structure. Evidence presented during proceedings included surveillance footage showing the suspects arriving at the venue, recordings released by investigators showing the attackers firing inside the building, and forensic reports linking weapons and clothing recovered during arrest to the assault. Prosecutors told the court the attack resulted in 150 deaths and more than 600 injuries. Medical examiners described gunshot wounds, burns, and crush injuries caused when sections of the roof collapsed during the fire. After the attack, the men fled Moscow in a vehicle toward the western region of Russia. Security forces intercepted them later the same day along a highway leading toward the border. Arrest footage reviewed in court showed officers ordering the suspects to the ground at gunpoint. Investigators stated that additional suspects were detained for providing transportation, funding, and logistical support connected to the operation. During the courtroom hearing, observers noted visible injuries on several defendants. Saidakrami Rachabalizoda appeared with a severe ear injury that reporters described as partially missing. Mohammad Sobir Faizov was brought into court in a wheelchair with medical tubes attached, appearing unable to hold his head upright. Shamsiddin Fariduni showed swelling and bruising across his face, while Dalerkhon Mirzoyev stood quietly as charges were translated. The judge formally charged all four with committing an act of terrorism resulting in mass casualties and ordered them held in pre-trial detention. Some defendants acknowledged involvement during questioning, while others remained silent throughout the proceedings. The court detailed how investigators traced communications, financial transfers, and travel movements linking the men to Islamic State Khorasan province. Authorities stated that one suspect admitted he had been promised payment for participating in the attack and had received part of the money before traveling to Moscow. Prosecutors argued the operation was coordinated weeks in advance and designed to create maximum public fear through both gunfire and fire inside an enclosed civilian venue. If convicted, the four men face life imprisonment under Russian terrorism laws. The judge ruled they would remain in custody while the investigation continues and additional accomplices are prosecuted. The courtroom hearings focused not only on guilt but on documenting the scale of the attack step by step, establishing how the assault was planned, executed, and carried out against civilians gathered for a peaceful event. In the end, the courtroom scene centers on accountability. The men accused of turning a concert hall into a mass casualty site now sit under heavy guard while families of victims wait for final judgment. The visible injuries, the detailed evidence, and the charges read aloud make clear that the trial is meant to document one of the deadliest terrorist attacks in recent Russian history and determine the punishment for those accused of carrying it out.